Here they come. All right, thank you guys all for joining on time. I'm watching the attendee list slowly tick up, so we'll just wait another couple minutes for people to join. Should have planned for music or some sort of entertainment. All right, we're holding at no. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Chris Goglin. I'm the Director of Energy Transition here at Clean Energy New Hampshire, helping to facilitate today's presentation by Mari Hernandez and Brian Lydic from IREC. The presentation is following from the Department of Energy's investigation 2022-001, where the Freeing the Grid report and the 2023 IREC Interconnection Model Rule Procedures were noted in comments and in discussion, and there was a noted interest among stakeholders in having IREC come and present on the details of both so we could dig in, and perhaps that ends up being content that is reflected in the DOE process, which is still ongoing. The way that we're going to run today is I'm going to turn it over very quickly to Mari and Brian, and thank you guys very much for joining us today. And the remainder of the time, I'll just be in the background. If you'd like, you can put questions into the question and answer box. If we have kind of holding it, the number that we have here, we can also have folks raise their hands and I can call on them. It's pretty easy to manage a conversation with under 30 people. I guess as a classroom teacher, I think so. And please be adding questions as you go. We will be periodically pausing to, check in on certain points, and just make sure that questions are being addressed within that area of the conversation rather than waiting all the way to the end. We do have an hour and a half scheduled for this, and that will allow us to hopefully get through the entire presentation and all the questions. Rather than go on anymore, I'm going to turn it over now to Mari and Brian. Thank you both very much for joining us. I really appreciate the work that you've put into this to make a presentation just for us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Can you hear me okay? We good? Okay. And thanks so much, Chris, for hosting and introducing us and allowing us to present. So I am Mari Hernandez. I'm going to switch this next slide. I don't usually run slides and present, so this will be interesting because I'm going to have to switch between screens. There we go. So my name is Mari Hernandez. I'm the Assistant Director of the Regulatory Program, and I'll be presenting along with Brian Lydic. IREC's Chief Regulatory Engineer. And we're excited to be with you today. Again, thanks for having us, and we're happy to talk about our resources. See if I can get it to switch. There we go. IREC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and through our work, we seek to build the foundation of the rapid adoption of clean energy and energy efficiency to benefit people, the economy, and our planet. We do this through 3 different programs: workforce development, local initiatives, and obviously our regulatory work, in which we focus on state regulatory policies to help to streamline the adoption of distributed energy resources. And we do that through our interconnection work, grid modernization, and integrated distribution planning. I want to say next slide, but it would just be saying it to myself. So for our agenda today, we're going to give overviews of both Freeing the Grid, which was released in June, and IREC's Model Interconnection Procedures, released last month. So for both of these resources, we provided webinars, which are on our website at irecusa.org. So we're not going to focus too much on the overviews, since you can go back to those and get really good summaries. We'll go through some of what we went through on those, but we want to move into kind of the New Hampshire specific recommendations and best practices that you all can check out through these resources. So, and we're also going to compare your rules to Connecticut and Massachusetts and look at how they stacked up on those different recommendations that we'll provide. So we'll highlight improvements New Hampshire could make to its rules, and then look at all of the recommendations together at the end and discuss how the state could focus its efforts in the near term. So I want to note that there's a lot of information in these slides. I tried to really pack it in. And like Chris said, we built in time to answer questions after each section. So feel free to, throw out some questions in the chat as we go along. I actually won't be following along there because I'm running slides, but Chris, like we talked about before, feel free to just jump in if there's some clarifying questions or anything else that we need to go over before we move on.
Absolutely, will do.
Yeah, during any of the slides. So, and then like Chris said, we'll have some time at the end to answer questions too if things come up at the very end of the presentation. So, and we always get this question. Definitely, I've already sent a PDF of these slides to Chris to share. So you'll have access to this. We really want this to be a resource for you as well. In addition to, I know you have the score sheet for all 3 states, for New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And we really hope that this can be a resource for you as well. So you'll have the slides, the PDF of the slides that you can refer to after the presentation. And so I'm going to go ahead and go into a quick Freeing the Grid overview, just so you have a little bit of background on it. So Freeing the Grid is a joint project between IREC and Vote Solar that we began working on in 2007. It was, at that time, we kind of started on it being an annual report card for states on interconnection and net metering. At that time, we were putting out interconnection and net metering grades at the same time. In this version, this is just interconnection grades. Vote Solar is planning to release grades for DER compensation policies at some point in the future. We're hoping next year. So it might be kind of staggered in terms of how these grades roll out moving forward. But yeah, the idea was really to provide a resource for states to use to improve their interconnection rules and ensure that they've incorporated best practices that promote a fair, efficient, and transparent interconnection process. So with Freeing the Grid, states can see how their interconnection rules measure up to best practices. As you see, we graded 37 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. And then we graded them using 56 criteria, which we identified as best practices. Brian will talk a little bit about this and how we developed our model rules, but all of our work is really grounded in our state experience. So we work across the country in big and smaller markets to really figure out what works in different markets. And so these best practices come out of that work through our collaboration with other organizations and experts. We work with utilities, developers, commissions, commission staff, stakeholders. We're starting to work on more equity-related issues. And so we've been working with more grassroots types organization for that work. So we really work across all stakeholders to try to come up with best practices. And in a lot of states, you know, we're seeing so many of these come up that this is how we actually determine that they are best practices. They've been adopted and also vetted in those states. And I just want to note that the 56 criteria that you saw in the score sheets for New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts are not necessarily they're definitely not an exhaustive list of everything that should be included in a state's interconnection rules, but they do represent what we identified as some of the most critical best practices. So if you just adopt those, it wouldn't be a full interconnection rule that, you know, that where you'd have every single provision you needed, but that's where the model rules come in and give you that full picture of what you can be looking at for all of your interconnection provisions. And now I'm going to go to why we base the grades on the interconnection rules. This is something that's come up. You know, what we wanted to do here is base the grading on what a state has incorporated in its interconnection procedures to highlight the importance of having streamlined interconnection rules that promote transparency. You're going to hear that word a lot. A lot of this is about transparency, fairness, and then ultimately accountability. And we also look at rules that, you know, we want to make sure that the rules are keeping up with new technologies, practices, and changing technical standards and requirements. So the provisions within, as you all know, within interconnection procedures lay out the process and requirements for connecting to the grid, and they help to set expectations for both customers and utilities. So there's a great section, the intro in the model rules actually has many of the questions that we think through as we're looking at, you know, what makes the most sense in interconnection rules. And a couple of them that I like to think about in freeing the grid is, you know, do the rules set a state up for success in terms of how well they've incorporated best practices and whether those can lead to streamlined interconnection? Can applicants and utilities reference them if there are issues, like if there are disputes, if customers see delays, are there things that they can refer back to about why this may not be something that should be happening? And then, as I noted here in the bottom, and no matter where a state falls in terms of DER penetration, up-to-date and transparent interconnection rules can benefit all stakeholders. And if they're designed well, they can help to improve the process and avoid unnecessary delays. And then here are some of the key takeaways. What we found is that 6 states plus the District of Columbia have incorporated more than half of the best practices that we identified in freeing the grid. New Mexico received the only A grade. In Arizona, California, DC, Illinois, Michigan, and New York all received B grades. And we found that 32 states need a decent number of improvements to ensure that the rules are keeping up with best practices. And so those received either a C or a D. And then there are 13 states that don't have statewide interconnection rules and received an F. And overall, there's a lack of standardization and consistency across states. I was actually surprised that no 2 states had the same rules and scoring. This lack of standardization means that there are 39 different sets of rules with varying requirements and processes, which can make it difficult to track and understand all of the different rule nuances in each state, particularly if you're a developer working across state lines, or if you're like me and just trying to score all of the different rules for freeing the grid. So that was my quick overview of freeing the grid. I want to pause here in case there are questions about freeing the grid. I know I went over that pretty quickly, but like I said, we are going to go through basically almost all of the criteria and recommendations and opportunities for improvement later. So I'll get back into more details about what we actually are recommending through freeing the grid. But if there are any questions about anything I discussed so far, please let me know. Chris, are you seeing
I
any?
am not seeing any questions at this time. And so for those of you that just joined late, we have a manageable number of people, so please just raise your hand. Alternatively, drop a question in the Q&A. But looks like, Mari, we're good for now.
Great. Well, this is kind of common. I know when you're getting into a presentation, it's hard to figure out like the questions right away, and usually they pop up throughout. So like we said before, just make sure to send those in through chat or raise your hand or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian to talk about the model rules.
Thanks, Mari. As Mari mentioned, there's no two rules are the same across the 50 states here, and that's one area where the model interconnection procedures can kind of stand as a bit of a goalpost, somewhat idealistic, but also not it's not always necessarily going to push all of the innovations that are there, because we really try to synthesize and reflect evolving best practices for interconnection of DERs. And so that's not going to be just based on our own ideas about what's going to work well, but they're based on what's already being done and what we think is working well across the different states. And these procedures were first published in 2005. So we've got a pretty long history with them. There are several states that have based their own procedures on probably those original procedures and maybe later versions. They've been updated about every 4 or 6 years since then, with the aim of providing utility commissions, utilities, developers, and other stakeholders with model language to enable more efficient, cost-effective, and fair interconnection process that supports state climate and clean energy goals. And a key feature of the model procedures is that they reflect those interconnection best practices that I was talking about that have been adopted and vetted, with the goal of providing the regulators, utilities, and stakeholders with confidence in those recommendations. So the way we develop those is through kind of an iterative process that involves 3 major activities, which is our own team's engagement in state interconnection proceedings, oftentimes through direct intervention as a stakeholder, as well as through technical assistance. Sometimes we're working with commissions directly or other parties to provide assistance along those paths. But we are pretty much always involved in several states at any given time on interconnection procedure proceedings. And we also coordinate with DER developers, utilities, energy equity and consumer advocates. I think Mari mentioned this already, regulators, also national labs and trade associations and other energy stakeholders, when developing ideas and working with stakeholders in different states to actually try them out in the interconnection rules. And then there's also engagement in research projects like Freeing the Grid, as well as our DOE-funded energy storage interconnection project that finished this year. That was called Batteries, or Building a Technically Reliable Interconnection Evolution for Storage, which developed consensus-based practices and model interconnection procedure language for 8 different interconnection challenges. So the procedures can be used as a starting point for states that don't yet have statewide interconnection rules, or states that need to undertake a major overhaul, and states that are continually improving their rules and are looking to adopt the new policies in specific areas, such as energy storage or, say, IEEE 1547, 2018. Let's go to the next slide. So I just want to highlight some of the key changes. So I think the 2019 rules were referenced here before, but we did just update them. I think they were released last month. And some of the key changes here are new energy storage provisions to enable managed exports, or what we call limited export. And that includes not just utilizing nameplate capacity in the evaluations, but defining and utilizing export capacity, which is just the amount that would basically feed back onto the grid from the DER site. If you're consuming something on site with load and you have some sort of export control, then we want to look at what are the actual effects on the grid, not just the total nameplate rating. And that's pretty important when it comes to energy storage specifically, because oftentimes your energy storage systems are controlled, and you're not just going to output full nameplate rating from those systems at the same time, say, as your PV system that's also on site. So export capacity kind of relies on export control. Some export controls can introduce inadvertent export, which is basically as you're trying to match load or at least follow a certain export limit, dependent on your load may drop off suddenly, and it takes a few seconds maybe for the power controls to catch up and drop the power on the output of the DER to match the load in order not to exceed that limit again. And so there's just a short period of time where you might be exceeding that limit. We call that inadvertent export. And in the batteries project, along with EPRI, we looked at how that inadvertent export may have grid issues or may introduce grid concerns, and under what conditions that would be. And we developed a new screen. There haven't been too many new screens developed since the early days of the FERC's SGIP. So this is a new one that we think kind of goes hand in hand as we try to roll out the concepts around export limiting and export capacity. Along with some of those things, we've got updated forms, updated application forms, basically, in order to capture more information about these systems, more information about the storage systems and the export capacity systems. And I think I could mention 1547 later, but also 1547-2018 related issues that wouldn't already be captured in today's standardized application forms. Then we've updated technical review screens kind of in relation to utilizing export capacity, as well as a couple other issues. So there's the fast track penetration screens, which would utilize export capacity. There's also a trend towards moving away from using peak load in the screen to using minimum load in the screen with more accurate data resolution on load. And there's changes in effective grounding, or the line configuration screens, it's sometimes called, to reflect to more streamlined practices in relation to inverters, and kind of make a difference. Note that there's a difference between how inverters and rotating machines react to ground faults and overvoltage. And then also utilizing limited export in the supplemental review, and having a new grounding screen that goes along with the initial review screen in supplemental review to more closely look at what the grounding needs are for inverters versus rotating machines. Then there's some updated terminology and forms and definitions. So some of the states that have based their rules on our previous procedures might have like level 1, 2, 3, 4 tiers. We've just renamed those to align with the FERC style naming of initial review and fast track supplemental review. And one of the reasons we did that is because level 3 was a non-export tier, which, along with the other export provisions, we didn't feel a need to keep around anymore, basically. And so now there's only 3 tiers as opposed to 4. And I mentioned before the application forms, but just increasing user friendliness of the entire rules. And then there's adoption of IEEE 1547-2018. There's a little bit of new guidance there. We'll look at, I think, on the next slide here, with some rule language and a template for incorporating technical requirements, which I'll talk about in the next slide, because it might maybe surprise some folks that there's potential need to update the actual procedures in relation to the technical standard 1547. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So before I move into what we've done with the model rules, just want to mention in terms of efforts related to 1547-2018 adoption, we have developed 2 resources that stakeholders could use to understand all the policy and technical considerations related to the standard and help streamline the adoption process, because it hasn't, in our experience, it hasn't been totally straightforward in most of the states as to what the best way to go through the adoption process is, or that everybody is aware of all the different points that really need to be addressed. So we've got this what we call the decisions options matrix for 1547 adoption that I think it's about 4 pages long in PDF format, that has a bunch of different decision options on how to address different issues that arise from 1547, as well as somewhat related issues that you might not think about if you're just reading the standard. And that's been developed. IREC consulted for HECO in Hawaii early on in their adoption efforts for 1547. And we've gone through several other states on adoption. So we've basically got a checklist of things to do, both in the near term, midterm, and long term, since you might want to take a phased approach, because it is quite an undertaking, actually. It's not a light thing, not an easy thing to simply add change the date from, say, 2003 to 2018 and call it a day. Also, we've got an older resource from 2019 that describes a lot of the new features of the standard and potential not necessarily roadblocks, but potential things to think about when adopting that standard. So I think these resources go hand in hand nicely. The decision options matrix gives a description of each of these issues, but the Making the Grid Smarter does a deeper dive on each of those, so that if you're not familiar with those issues, you can get a little, there's actually references in the matrix to specific chapters and whatnot there. So definitely recommend checking those out as part of the 1547 adoption efforts. Let's go to the next slide here. So in terms of what actually we think needs to go into the rules, there are different ways this has been done in different states. California has taken the approach of putting all the technical requirements actually in the interconnection rule itself. We don't necessarily think that's necessary, and a lot of states don't want to do that, and a lot of states, have separate technical rules, or the technical rules are simply an aside in a handbook, developed by the utility or whatnot. But there are some reasons we think there's an approach that includes incorporation of some language on a limited set of technical requirements within the rules, and that there could be that most of the other settings and requirements could be contained in what we call a technical interconnection and interoperability requirements document, and have a process for kind of setting up a process for the creation of that document and stewardship of that document, so that there could be stakeholder input and commission review of some level to make sure all parties are on the same page about how mostly how the new capabilities that are coming in with smart inverters in 1547-2018, how those will be deployed. And the standard itself also actually kind of directs some activities directly to the utility commission and says you should be the one to decide what the ride-through category is, for instance, because there needs to be a balance between the bulk system needs, or the ISO New England needs, and the distribution system operator needs. So we've got a template for that technical interconnection interoperabilities requirement document, which wouldn't really be a part of, or typically would not be a part of the procedures, but we put a template in there to guide folks on what types of technical requirements should be noted in there in order to guide developers and installers on how to set up the DER in the field and commission them, and then some limited language around adoption, like an adoption date, having an effective date as to when 1547 and its associated certification requirements would go into effect, as well as those category assignments. let's go to the next slide then, Mari. So in terms of how these two things, freeing the grid and the model procedures, fit together, we would like to see in every state a process to revisit the interconnection procedures on a regular basis to ensure that they are evolving and keeping up with the best practices that have been emerging and continuing to streamline grid interconnection processes. And as we're seeing in high penetration areas, the typical interconnection processes that have been in place for a while start to break down, basically, and you need to start to innovate. And we're not done. We're certainly not done with this iteration of the model interconnection procedures. We're updating them all the time, and we also think there probably needs to be a pretty large conceptual overhaul in different areas. We won't get into all that, but we do think this represents where we'd like to see most of the country get to, at least today, and then we need to start taking those next steps to deal with even higher penetration. But freeing the grid basically helps us identify the interconnection challenges that a state is having or New Hampshire is having, and best practices and opportunities for improvement. So you can kind of see what kind of concepts are there. And then the model interconnection procedures give you a way to kind of couch those concepts in the rule language. And I think I'll pass it back to Mari, or we'll start running through what those individual issues are in freeing the grid.
Any questions for Brian? And thank you, Brian, for taking us through that. It would appear that you fully explained everything perfectly.
Always.
All right, if a question does occur to you, or if you're just having some technical difficulty hitting your hand up now, feel free to flag one. But right now, I'll turn it over to Mari.
Great. Thanks again, Chris, and thanks, Brian. So yeah, this just shows kind of a bird's eye view at a glance comparison of New Hampshire's score and grade and ranking compared to Connecticut and Massachusetts, and then comparing that to freeing the grid and the total possible points and what an A grade range looks like. So yeah, you all have seen this. Now you've seen the scoring sheet, the grade sheet that we put out on the website. So you've seen your grade and your score. You may not have seen your rank, 26th, and I know it seems kind of like middle of the pack there. But I do want to note, and I meant to look up New Mexico's previous grade before getting on this call and completely forgot until now. But New Mexico is our only A grade, and they just updated their rules last year. And before that, I can guarantee they were likely a C or D, because I know they were not in the A or B range. I didn't do the scoring the last time around. That I think the last time we put the grades out was in 2017, so it's been a while now. So with New Mexico's most recent process, they took themselves from a C or D to an A grade. So I just want to note that I know this probably doesn't look great on paper, and seeing how many points your state got didn't make you feel great. And then also comparing it to Connecticut and Massachusetts, it looks kind of daunting, I think, in this view. But I do want to point out that we're going to go through ways that New Hampshire can improve their grade, and not necessarily doing every single thing that you'll see listed here. So and we're not trying to make this too overwhelming, but
Mari, can I just ask a quick question?
One,
I got a helpful text from someone noting that if folks don't want to ask a question with their hand up, if you put stuff in the question and answer box, I'm the only person that can see it other than Mari and Brian. And so if you have a question that you would like to kind of just keep anonymous, so you can, pose a topic, but not necessarily reflect back on, have it reflect on you, your organization as a position, we can certainly do that. And I do have a question that is in the questions, and it is whether the New Mexico rules that you just kind of talked about have been successful in opening closed circuits. It was one of 3 states that had closed circuits. And I don't know if you can go into that.
Yeah, I do not know the answer to that. I don't know if Brian does or not.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not privy to that. The rules are, I don't actually know when they got implemented, or even if they are fully implemented yet. I believe they are. But yeah, that's a good question, because the export capacity provisions could potentially allow you to connect to a closed circuit, but I don't think, I believe some of those closed circuits were addressed through a different manner. They might have been more of a planning limit um, rather than closed in terms of the actual interconnection screens and study process. So I wish I had a better answer for you. I thought I had heard maybe some news about that in the last little bit, but I'm not certain that enough time has actually passed from implementing the rules to get you an answer on that. But I'll see if I can ask around, because one of our other engineers is a little bit closer working on New Mexico.
Thanks, Brian. Is there anything else, Chris?
Does not appear we have any other questions at this time, although I think some will be coming.
Okay, great. And I wanted to point out one other state, which is Arizona, which in our last round had an F grade because it did not have statewide interconnection rules, and now has a B grade. So it's another example of a state that kind of started from scratch, so didn't have statewide rules, and received a B grade for their grades that they were updated, I believe, in 2019. So yes, I just want to point out a couple of success stories. So I know there's work to be done here that can be done, but I think it can also move you up pretty quickly if you do choose to update your rules. All right, I'm gonna go to again, like I pointed out before, there's a ton of information. You'll receive the PDF of these slides. You do not have to take down all of this information. But what we did here in Freeing the Grid, so this all links back to Freeing the Grid, and then I'll show you how each of these and the criteria under them, particularly the criteria that your state has not yet adopted, where you can find it in the model rules as well. But what we did here is we broke the Freeing the Grid criteria into 10 categories. So you see that here, and then that was also in the state grade sheets, and in the score sheets also you could see the major categories on the left-hand side, and the criteria was next to that. The idea was basically not to overwhelm states with all of the criteria, those 56 criteria that you saw. It was really to help figure out if there were certain categories where the state was doing well and others where they needed improvements, to help kind of prioritize where to start. But as you saw, and other states with C grades, and states and pretty much all grades with these D grades, that prioritization is a little harder to suss out since in the grade sheet it just looks like you need to work on every category. And we heard from some states that it also looked like they hadn't received any points in the categories with an X. So, but what we actually had done is created point thresholds for each category, and if the state met that, they received a check mark for that category. So you can see in the darker green color where Connecticut and Massachusetts received check marks because they met those point thresholds. And some of those were a little bit, so you would think, oh, well, maybe if you got 2 points in the rule applicability, you would get a check mark. But in some cases we would make, it's kind of discretionary where, well, if you only got 2 points, that was likely because you didn't incorporate storage. And that's actually what we consider to be one of the most critical best practices in that category. So really, to get that check mark for that category, you need to have all 3 points. So we kind of did some of that throughout. So it wasn't necessarily you just had to get half of the points in each category. So we're going to go through these categories one by one. And I want to point out that there may be recommendations under each of these that you'll want to designate as more near-term or longer-term priorities. So I would encourage you not to think of this as an all or nothing set of recommendations. And we recognize that there are some that may require more time for adoption. So Brian was talking about IEEE 1547/2018 and how that can be, it's definitely a process. So just throwing that out there. And then as you saw in Freeing the Grid, we highlighted a handful of recommendations that New Hampshire should consider, and I'll go over those in the last couple of slides. So you're going to see a lot of recommendations and then kind of a summary of those recommendations, but I'll highlight some of the recommendations we gave in Freeing the Grid and what that would do to your grade if you were just to focus on a handful of those recommendations.
Mari, if I can just step in, there's a question for the possible points on the right-hand side. We see that some are 3 and some are 10. How were the possible points per category determined? Like, why did you give 1 a 3, 1 a 7, and 1 a 10?
Yeah, that's a good question. So determining the points was actually kind of a difficult process. So partially it related to how many criteria were in those categories. So in rule applicability, there were fewer criteria. So that's why the possible points are 3. But then we also had to determine, well, how would we prioritize more value? So even if it's fewer criteria, if we want to prioritize those a little bit higher, we might add more value regardless. So there are some within the categories, some criteria within the categories that are worth more than just 1 point because we were prioritizing those higher. And I think if you go to it's going to be hard to explain here because you're not seeing the breakout of each criterion. So if you look at the score sheet, and Chris, I know you sent that out of all three states, for New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts. You can kind of see that breaks down the points, the number of points that that were possible for both criteria. And I think we didn't put the total for the full category, but you can figure it out from the criteria. That's basically that looks at how we prioritize both, mostly like by criterion. So by each best practice, we tried to say, all right, so in initial review screens, we really think this minimum load screen is really important to get right. So this is going to be worth a little bit higher than one of the other screens. And it's going to be worth even more if you base that on export capacity. And we'll get to some of that. But so that will actually give you a better understanding of that. But so I would say for each of the categories, the possible points are based on the number of criteria and then how we valued those criteria within the category. So I know that's a little bit higher level, but it's hard to get into too much specifics without you seeing the actual criteria. And we'll go through it a little bit, you'll be able to see, but some of these are now combined. I do want to say that. So when we go through each of these categories, you'll see some of the recommendations have combined some of the criteria from Freeing the Grid. So you might see a little bit of an inflated value because we put 2 of them together. Any other questions? And if that didn't answer.
Yeah, we are starting to stack up and get some questions on this. Which, just to note, I was incorrect. You can submit anonymous comments, but if you submit comments without clicking the anonymous button, we can see who you are. But we did have a question regarding the actual timeline ranges for this scoring and regarding major interconnection stages and what was assumed for New Hampshire. Some stakeholders have seen those timelines stretch out by months, and they are wondering if that is taken into account. Like, how do you measure the timelines and score accordingly?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't emphasize this maybe enough when I was talking about how we did the scoring, but we just based it on the rules. So we just based it on what we saw in the rules. And so those timelines that are in the rules are what we're grading on. We are not grading on implementation or how like experiences on the ground. So that is something that it is a challenge for this type of scorecard. because would be so hard to do that for every single state and to understand, it would really take a lot more work. But then, I did kind of talk about why we think it's so important to get the rules right and to have something to refer back to. So if those issues continually happen, be able to refer back to the rules and say, this is what's supposed to be the practice. So yeah, the short answer is we did not take that into account. What we look at are the rules when we do the scoring. And that goes for every category and every criterion.
All right.
And if I could add, yeah, when we look at the data sharing and reporting, that's one aspect of being able to monitor, performance according to the rules that a lot of states don't have. And that's why it would be really challenging to actually monitor what's happening on the ground, because that information just isn't collected. The best we can get sometimes is just hearing through the grapevine, from developers that have gone through the interconnection process, unfortunately, because that reporting isn't there.
All right, and I just want to put one more out there, and I think we discussed this yesterday in our pre-call, but how do you address state policies that have improved access of interconnection but aren't yet reflected in the rules? They haven't been updated for existing processes that expedite interconnection or improved customer experience.
Yeah, another great question. So we had this issue in Hawaii. So Hawaii's interconnection rules have not been updated, but their practices have. So HECO, the utility there, has updated their rules, updated their practices so that they are more efficient than what the rules say they are. So again, we just to grade uniformly, and because it is hard to get that nuance for every single state to understand where the practices are actually going beyond the rules. That's really actually hard to figure out for each state, especially if we were just focused on one state. We could, we could just score one state and figure that out. But I think doing it on this level is really difficult to get that. So we just graded on the rules in Hawaii, and Hawaii actually received a C, even though it does have pretty streamlined practices from what developers have told us there, and from hearing from the utility there. So, and also they have some practices that go beyond on reporting, on utility reporting, now that they have to report on their performance incentive mechanism requires them to share timelines. And apparently they do that really frequently. So it's really great transparency. That was also decided outside of the interconnection rules. So it was in a different order and not actually integrated in the interconnection rules. So that is also not reflected in their grade. We may decide to change that in the future for things that we know are happening, but we wanted to be really consistent in our grading, because we didn't want it to be where, well, this state reached out and said they're doing this, it's not in the rules, so we need to update it, but then not do that for other states. And especially if other states don't share that information. So we wanted to make sure that everyone was on a level playing field when we did this grading. But great question. What I had shared with Chris before is that from what we can tell, and this is working across states, there are instances where there may be practices that do go beyond the rules in a very positive way. And then there also may be practices that are worse than the rules. Like whoever mentioned, timelines lasting even longer, or an interpretation of the rules that actually limits or is more conservative than what the rule intended. So we've actually seen it go both ways. And so that's another reason why we just focused on the rule itself, because we like there to be, something concrete on the record that you can reference and go back to, especially for disputes, and something that is actually there just as the backbone. And we hope that, it will be a minimum versus just the maximum. It would be great if most states actually went beyond their rules in a positive way.
So we do have a couple more questions, but just we're past half, so want to make sure we get through. So keep going, and we can always circle back to those questions.
Great. Yeah, and there are a couple of these that won't take too long to get through. So yeah, I don't want to not get to some of these. So we'll start with rule applicability. So in this category, we just have one recommendation. This slide looks a little different because it was only one recommendation. I could include both the Connecticut example and why Connecticut got credit here, and some language from the model rules. But the rest of these are kind of focused on the recommendation and then have a reference to the model interconnection procedures. And then when you see a circle that's filled in, that means the state got full credit for that recommendation. So Connecticut here. So these recommendations are for New Hampshire, but we wanted to point out when Connecticut or Massachusetts got credit or partial credit. And if they receive partial credit, you'll see a half filled in circle. So for your reference, if you look at this later, that's what those little circles with the state in them are. So explicitly including storage as an eligible technology in the rules is both a fairly simple but also important update. And here you see a couple ways to do it. Connecticut defined generating facility and included energy storage under that. And in our model rules, we use distributed energy resource and include the capability to generate and store electricity, and separately define energy storage device. And then we explicitly state that it can be considered a DER or generator. New Hampshire received 2 points in this category so the 2 points from at the top there come from stating that the rules apply to all PUC jurisdictional interconnections and not limiting that to a lower system size. I'm just going to keep going, but Chris, stop me if something comes up or any kind of clarifying questions come up.
Yeah, right now we're where we were before. Keep going.
Great. The streamline review category addresses project size eligibility for faster review processes and other provisions that impact the review process. So New Hampshire's rules provide simplified review for 10 kVA projects, so it received credit for that. But Connecticut and Massachusetts allow systems up to 25 kilowatts to go through simplified review without a required supplemental review for systems over 10 kilowatts. So our first recommendation is to increase the system size eligibility. And then the state could receive an additional point if it based the 25 kilowatt threshold on export capacity, which I have that in the third recommendation there. So our second recommendation is to create a fast track review process for systems up to 5 megawatts. And that can be based on both line capacity and distance from the substation. Connecticut allows for systems up to 2 megawatts under fast track, so it didn't receive the full credit there. And then Massachusetts did receive full credit because it doesn't specify a size limit for its expedited review process. So same as with the eligibility for simplified review, we recommend basing eligibility for fast track on export capacity as well. And then Massachusetts got credit for that export capacity part because they didn't specify a size limit, and that it's really meant to maximize the number of systems or the size of systems that can go through as long as they pass certain screens. And then the last two recommendations are on group studies and equitable interconnection. So on group studies, we recommend allowing projects that will be located within a shared geographic location to be studied together. And we're actually going to be releasing a paper next month on current practices that we're seeing across the country. So because we're still determining what the best practices are in this area, we haven't included many specifics here on what that should look like, both in freeing the grid and what you saw in the criterion for that one, and in the model rules. We did include that, so you see that reference at the bottom for group study, but it's just not super prescriptive. Massachusetts did get credit for its group study option, and other states have incorporated group or cluster studies as well. And then on equitable interconnection, this is definitely an emerging topic that also doesn't have a definitive set of best practices as of yet. But in freeing the grid, we wanted to signal that this is something that states could start to think about. The only state that has included this type of provision is New Mexico. It considers low income and underserved communities in determining whether there are public benefits related to cost sharing. So it received credit for that. But this is something that we're currently exploring with other organizations and stakeholders, and we're compiling our learning so far and also working to identify initial solutions to address any barriers. So because best practices haven't been identified, this is not in our model rules. So you don't see a reference here for that. So that's something that's kind of up and coming. And I know Brian mentioned this, but some of the differences you'll see between freeing the grid and the model rules are, these are best practices we're seeing in states that have been adopted and they've been tried and they have worked in the states, or we've seen that they've worked in the states. Freeing the grid has gone a little beyond that, where we've seen states where we're trying to highlight some of the emerging issues. So we're trying to be a little more forward thinking in some of those, but it's really pretty minimal there, like in terms of how many of those we went beyond the model rules. So this was one of those, that equitable interconnection. And group studies, we're very similar with the model rules on freeing the grid, in that we're still kind of waiting for a better, more kind of definitive approach to group studies that will work. So stay tuned for that report that's coming out next month.
All right, thanks, Mari. Quick question from the audience, and I wish there was a little bit more context to the question, but how or why did New Hampshire get 0.5 in the streamlined review? And I'm not clear if they're asking how did it get any points or how did it only get 0.5 points?
Yeah, so the 0.5 points were for the simplified process. So if you look at the scoring sheet, you'll see that you received the total point value of 0.5 for simplified process for certified inverter-based generators up to 10 kilowatts. And I know the simplified process is technically 100 kVA, but because you're automatically kicked into supplemental review above 10 kVA, we had to kind of categorize this into that initial criterion for this. So that's why it got 0.5 and not higher than that, because the next, and another half a point would be up to 25 kilowatts, and then another full point, or actually another 2 points, would be to base that on export capacity. So that's why you see the kind of different points that could be added for the different provisions.
All right, great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so, and then we're going on to modifications. This is another one that's pretty short. There's just a couple. So this concerns three types of modifications: minor grid upgrades, minor project modifications, and then material modifications. New Hampshire received credit for this as part of the simplified process. That was they received credit. Yeah, so they received New Hampshire received half a point for material modification, and received a full point for minor grid upgrades. But so the recommendations here are for minor, to add the ability to make minor project modifications in the rules, because we did not see that mentioned. So allowing customers to make minor modifications to projects to resolve issues identified during the screening or study processes. Both Massachusetts and Connecticut received partial credit because though their rules allow for minor project modifications in response to failed screens, we're looking for a more customer-driven process where the customer can determine how best to modify or redesign their project to avoid further study, and ultimately have the option to not just downsize the system, but potentially add storage. So it's just adding a little bit to that process. So they received just partial credit for that. And then on the last recommendation for material modifications, New Hampshire and Connecticut use the same definition of material modification. but just don't describe the process for reviewing them. So they both just received a half a point. And then in Massachusetts, material modification is only mentioned under the disconnection section of the rules, but it's not defined beyond that, so it didn't receive credit. And then just going back real quick, I missed a part of this. So on minor grid upgrades, which New Hampshire received credit for, did want to note that I'll talk about, or I talked about establishing a fast track, or no, I talked about establishing a fast track review process for systems up to 5 megawatts. So if New Hampshire establishes a fast track review process, it should make sure that that language for minor grid upgrades, the ability to make those and not have to go on to then further review or further study, should be incorporated in that fast track review process as well, since it is already incorporated in a simplified process, which is great. So that's why you received a point there. All right, and then I'm going to move on to timelines and efficiency. I'll try to keep this moving because I know Brian still has a few to get through as well. This category is focused on review timeframes throughout the interconnection process, including from the initial application review to screening and study, and all the way through to the interconnection agreement and permission to operate. New Hampshire received credit for 4 of these timeframes, including application completeness, simplified review, and interconnection agreement timeframes. There were a couple of those, and New Hampshire received credit for both. For our recommendations, the first is related to fast track review, which would need to be established as I talked about, but the best practice we've seen is 15 business days. New Hampshire currently allows 40 business days for supplemental review, and we recommend reducing that to 20 days. Massachusetts limits supplemental review to 20 days, and Connecticut lists 10 business days as a requirement. There was no time frame listed for the study process in New Hampshire. We recommend setting that for less than 120 calendar days or 85 business days. Our model rules specify 40 business days for the system impact review or the system impact study, and 45 business days for the facility study. Massachusetts meets this by setting 55 business days for the impact study and 30 business days for the detailed study. And then the time frame for the utility to provide permission to operate was also not listed in the rules, but we found it's a best practice for states to specify that once all reviews and system checks have been performed, so customers know when to expect to begin operation once all those requirements have been met. Freeing the grid doesn't provide a time frame, but our model rules specify 5 business days following the completion of the inspection, which is the same as what Massachusetts requires. And then going on to interconnection costs and requirements, we looked at best practices for both the costs as well as project requirements like site control, insurance, and external disconnect switches. Chris, did you get off mute?
I am off mute now.
I saw something. I thought I saw something click on and off, so I didn't know if you were trying to.
No, I'm checking on something. It seems like a statement was made. I'm just clarifying that it's not a question.
Great. So the intent of this category is to keep project costs reasonable and increase transparency and cost certainty. New Hampshire received credit for meeting the criteria on site control, external disconnect switches, insurance, and application fees. So our first recommendation is on capping the supplemental review costs at $2,500. Though New Hampshire limits the cost to $1,250, according to the rules, that only applies for systems that are up to 100 kVA, which is why it didn't receive credit. Connecticut and Massachusetts didn't receive credit for this one either, since Connecticut doesn't cap costs and Massachusetts caps the cost at $4,500. The next recommendation is meant to improve cost certainty for projects by creating a cost envelope for upgrade costs, stating that the final cost must be within 25% of the original cost estimate. In freeing the grid, we give credit for anywhere from 10 to 30%, but Massachusetts cap is 25%, so I included that here. And I just wanted to share, because I don't think I said this up front, that our hope by highlighting whether Massachusetts or Connecticut receive credit or partial credit, is that, those are states. I know that, you all are closely linked in terms of there being some utilities that work across state lines. So my hope is that if you, obviously we have our model interconnection procedure language here, but you also can look to these other states and look to why did they get credit and what language do they use, or why did they only get partial credit? So that is really the hope that that can help to, to be a reference, I guess. And then lastly on this slide is cost allocation of grid upgrade costs. That can be done through group studies, fixed fees, waivers, etc. This is another area where we weren't super prescriptive because we've seen states do this in different ways, and we're still determining what the best practices are for this one and in relation to group studies. So we know Massachusetts is doing work on this related to distribution planning, so it's definitely an area that we're continuing to watch. Because Massachusetts has a group study option that mentions cost allocation, it received credit for this. Connecticut received just partial credit because it's an option the utility can recommend, but not something the applicant can choose upfront. So that is actually it for the ones I'm going to go over. I'm going to switch it to Brian, but pause real quick in case there are questions. I'm not hearing any, so I'm just going to.
Yeah, I think for now, keep going.
Great.
Not seeing any questions. Oh, we do have one question. Vaughn, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mari. Thanks for being here. One question just procedurally with regards to Arizona. I know you raised that they had nothing and then, I think got a B in this round. Do you have any insight into how they worked on adopting rules in Arizona? Did they start from the model interconnection procedures and then adapt them to what Arizona was ready for? They cut them from whole cloth, or do you have any insight into that?
That's a good question. We were actually not direct interveners there. We did provide technical assistance and worked with one of the organizations that was directly intervening. Brian, do you have any insight into their process? Did we lose Brian?
We are down to 2 panelists. Yes.
Let me see if.
I'm going to, if it's all right, let Steve Reisma either ask a question or maybe he has something to say about Arizona. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I mean, Arizona, I think IREC's scorecard hasn't been updated in a few years. So the process in Arizona took about, I'd say, a year. Where the rules became successful was really the leadership that the commissioners took, where the industry had expert witnesses like myself working with the trade groups, and we proposed reasonable, actionable paths forward that really made sense, and the commission aligned with the industry. So I mean, this all comes down to the actions taken by the commission based on the record to ensure successful processes. If the utilities got their wishes, the interconnection rules would look nothing like they are today. And instead, we have good proactive rules. There's essentially notification processes for small DERs that limit exports, and just very good allowances for the industry to be robust. It wasn't a formal stakeholder process, but it was really multiple. Well, it was a brief stakeholder process that the meetings were infrequent. But it was multiple rounds of filings into the docket, as well as hearings in front of the different commissioners that they allowed for remote participation within those hearings as well, which was helpful for those of us that could not be in the hearing room. And I'm Stephen Rimshaw with Sunrun.
All right, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Vaughn, for the questions and the follow up on Steve's part. Question that is, you've been making recommendations as you go, Mari, and to the extent that you can respond to this, does IREC have recommendations for taking their best practices and customizing them for states and jurisdictions, or does it recommend against too much customization? So like changing the IREC model procedures, and you're recommending actually avoiding doing that. Or has there been a state who has taken the model rules and enabled a thoughtful process to customize, and that New Hampshire should consider looking into this?
Yeah, I think states have taken different approaches to using both our model rules and FERC's small generator interconnection procedures. And usually it looks like a mixture of things. Like, I know Brian mentioned there have been some states that just have adopted or have started fully with our model rules, and then Maine is one that comes to mind that just adopted our rules, and other states have largely taken from our model rules and then adapted pieces for their state. So I think there are different ways to do it. I think what we point to is that we think it's a really good starting point. And we think where you can simplify. So what we really try to do with this is to simplify the rules, because especially, I don't know if you all have looked, is Brian trying to rejoin? I don't see. Apparently he lost internet.
Okay, he should just be able to jump right back in because he's got the panelist.
Oh, great. Okay. I'm still not seeing that he's back online yet.
All right.
So,
But you stick with the question, and I'll see if I can reach Brian.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think there are different ways to do it. I think what we wanted to do is to simplify our rules, and we hope that they would be easy to have as a starting point, to either be able to pull the language directly into your rules or to start from and then build off of. We wouldn't say, don't tweak them for your state. We definitely, wouldn't. You can take them and then, work with them, or just like pull from them where you need language on particular provisions. So I would think that, I would say that there are different ways to use it. Of course, we would want a state to just like work directly off of it. And we know that, states have done that with SGIP. And as I mentioned, states have done that with our model rules. But it kind of depends on what Brian talked about, like kind of identifying where your challenge is. And, we're trying to identify opportunities here for improvements, prioritizing those and figuring out where you want to go with this. Do you want to overhaul the rules? Are they really difficult to understand right now? Do you want to start with a different framework? That might be where you would then want to start from the model rules if they're more simplified than what you have. So I think there are different ways to go about it. That's the short answer. Brian said he is logging back in now, which is great because this is his section. I can probably speak to a little bit of it, but it's much more technical. So some of it he's covered, so we can probably go through pretty quickly.
All right, while we wait for Brian, are there any questions on this, any remaining questions on the scoring?
But these are really great questions, and thank you all for sticking with us through all of the recommendations. And I just want to say this: this is the first state where we've done this for Freeing the Grid, where we've kind of gone into each one of these. So this has been interesting for me too.
So while we're waiting for Brian, Mari,
yeah.
Oh, it looks like Brian has rejoined us, but just real quick, and maybe do this at the end after Brian's had a chance to talk, because we are closing in on time. But one of the things that we spoke about yesterday is that your set of recommendations doesn't need to be all done, and that you can actually achieve like 80% of the work with just a handful and still have great strides. And then there's marginal gains that could be made, not marginal gains, but like incremental gains that can be achieved when the more difficult recommendations have been worked through a process.
Yeah. And we'll highlight those. Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the things we want to note here is that we're not looking to, I think, like I said, you'll have to decide whether you want a full overhaul, and maybe it makes sense to look at more of these provisions, or if you want a more targeted approach where you are just going to try to pick off a few things that you think would help more in the near term, and then work on some things midterm and longer term. So I think it kind of depends on the approach you want to take here. But yes, we are going to point out some of those handful of recommendations from Freeing the Grid and what that would mean for New Hampshire score.
All right, apologies for introducing that too early.
No, that's great. So Brian, we are to you. This good timing coming back right after the questions.
Yeah, sorry about that. Of course, my internet would go out with the construction going on out on the streets. But have you gone through this slide already, or just starting here?
I have not. I haven't started.
Okay. I guess we should probably kind of breeze through the next little set of slides since we're running low on time. So I'll try to go through these a little bit more quickly. But the updated standards and provisions, this category aims to encourage states to adopt IEEE 1547/2018 and related technical requirements, as well as provisions related to allowing for export control. And those recommendations help to clarify DER requirements for interconnection, as well as identify export control means that have been vetted and approved for operations. So New Hampshire didn't receive credit for 1547 adoption, although it does mention 1547/2018 because it wasn't clear to us that it was fully adopted, other than just superficially with the date change, since there's no mention of compliance date or any other specifics on it. So Connecticut received partial credit on the second recommendation, since about half the settings we're looking at are referenced in the rules. Again, the model rules provide model language and a template for incorporating those technical requirements. And in order to incorporate the concept of export capacity in the rules, it needs to be defined. We recommend ensuring that nameplate capacity is defined to differentiate between those two. Massachusetts received partial credit for that, since nameplate's defined in the definitions, and there's an explanation of maximum export capacity, but it's not in the definitions section, so it's kind of hidden in the group study related stuff on cost allocation. So to streamline and use the interconnection of export control DERs, interconnection rules should identify export control methods that have been approved and vetted, including power control systems. This makes it easy for the developer to understand what types of equipment and setups would be allowed for by the utilities, and basically gives a baseline without further review really having to be done. So we can use certified devices or relays, those kinds of a thing. Might as well just go to the next slide here on initial review screens, and I'll just, luckily you'll all have the slides to look at these a little bit further. I know they're pretty dense, but so New Hampshire doesn't currently have fast track review for projects that don't qualify for simplified review. So first we'd recommend fast track review level and incorporating the screens that are listed here to represent best practices that have emerged. Well, some of which have been around for a long time, and some of which have emerged in the last few years. And I mentioned some of those as part of the key changes there, including the minimum load and invert and export screens. Massachusetts and Connecticut both use 15% of peak load in those penetration screens, so that's why they didn't receive the credit for the minimum load screen. And we'd recommend an updated line configuration screen or effective grounding screen, as well as a shared secondary transformer screen. And both Connecticut and Massachusetts use the typical SGIP language, which is what we want to update and do something a little more simplified, as well as something that differentiates between either more simplified or differentiates between inverters and rotating machines. And then I think we can go to the next slide here. So this is supplemental review screens. There is a New Hampshire process tied to simplified review, but the screening is not included in the rules, and we recommended, like we said in the last one, recommend adopting fast track review process for larger projects, and then providing supplemental review, a defined supplemental review process for projects that fail the initial review screens. And again, those screens should be spelled out and include a minimum load screen that evaluates aggregated export capacity compared to minimum load. Massachusetts received the credit for the minimum load screen since they have 100% minimum load in supplemental review, but they're not utilizing the export capacity yet. So it received 2 out of the 4 points. And then we'd recommend having a voltage and power quality screen, utilizing something similar to the model rules. The language has been updated from what we included in freeing the grid, and part of which because some of this stuff is happening in real time, and best practices are still emerging. I will mention that supplemental review, besides the penetration screen, a lot of the other screens, there's typically basically broken up into 3 screens. There's a voltage and power quality screen, and then a supplemental review screen, or sorry, a voltage and power quality screen, and then a safety and reliability screen. And those are somewhat open-ended, so it's not just screen-based. There are screens, but it allows the utility some flexibility into how they evaluate those screens. And we're leaning towards adding a little more specificity on some things, like for grounding, supplemental grounding purposes. But there's still, this is kind of like a little bit of flexibility, kind of puts you somewhere between a confined screening process and an open-ended study process. Let's go to the next slide. On data sharing and reporting, this category focuses on providing grid information to help customers with project siting and design, but also providing useful and detailed information along with the screening and study results that you'd get back from the process, along with itemized upgrade cost estimates and regular reporting on interconnection timelines and costs, so that those metrics are known to the utility commission and stakeholders. So in this category, the focus is on providing those things so that you can monitor. Mari talked about these freeing the grid is based on what do the rules say, not on implementation, but you can monitor implementation through monitoring how closely parties hew to these timelines and costs and whatnot. So New Hampshire's point in this category comes from the requirement to provide detailed study results. But to expand on that type of transparency, you could require similar detail in the screening results, and also require that upgrade cost estimates for be detailed and itemized, especially as part of the study process. Massachusetts received partial credits because it provides detailed information just for the supplemental review and not simplified or initial review screens. And Connecticut also received partial credit because it only provides those detailed results for fast track and not simplified or supplemental. I guess I'll try to get through a couple more things here. Yeah, on the queue, utilities may already post and update that internet connection queue regularly, but we're evaluating this based on whether it was included in the rules or not, and it wasn't mentioned. So in both our model rules and freeing the grid, we recommend providing additional information in the queue that would allow customers to track timelines for the different steps in the process. That's being done in places like DC, Maine, New York, and a little bit in Maryland. And the third recommendation is on reporting interconnection timelines and costs, like max, mean, and median stats for processing timelines and costs. I won't get into what all the different states are doing there. And then the last recommendation is allowing customers to request pre-application reports. New Hampshire did not receive that since there is a pre-application review that addresses feasibility or whether system upgrades are necessary, but a pre-application report would give information, more information about the proposed interconnection location, in order to for a developer to understand, you know, what are the potential risks, I guess, associated with that. And those would usually come along with some sort of a cost that the developer would pay. Let's go to the next slide on dispute resolution, which looks how disputes can be resolved, whether or not there's informal options to address that issue. New Hampshire didn't receive credit for having dispute resolution process, since the rules just rely on formal complaint dispute process, which is distinct from the NEM rules. And reason that complaint process doesn't receive credit is because the interconnection customers, you know, might be hesitant to pursue formal complaints through the PUC and might be better served through other options. So the best practice, we think, is to include a dispute resolution process within the interconnection rules, details, including timelines, and provide both informal and formal pathways to resolve any disputes. And, you know, as mentioned in the slide there, you could offer mediator services through the commission or an ombuds person to track and facilitate dispute resolution. I'll hand it back to you, Mari. Take it home.
Great. Yeah, I know we don't have a ton more time, but so these last two slides, in these last two slides, I've compiled all of the recommendations that you saw in the previous slides. Again, not to overwhelm you, but to highlight some of the recommendations from Freeing the Grid. So we had about a handful of recommendations there. I took those, I highlighted the boxes where that apply. There are a couple that go a little beyond that, but it was, you know, if you adopt a fast track process, we're hoping that you also include that, you know, a supplemental review process within that. So it makes sense to kind of include the timeline there, and the fast track process, it would make sense to include a timeline for that process as well. So there were a couple of things that I added on to the Freeing the Grid recommendations, but so I've highlighted two categories: rule applicability and streamline review, and then two bullets within the timelines category. These could be near-term updates to help streamline and add transparency to the rules. With these changes, New Hampshire would improve its score by 8.5 points and would go to 21 points total, meaning that it would be bumped up to a C grade. And then the next one, you'll see the same kind of situation where I've, whoops. Let's see, there we go. That's a problem with trying to scroll on two different screens. So you see, like, similarly, I've highlighted bullets in the updated standards and initial review screens categories, as well as in the supplemental review category, the full thing there. So, and what's highlighted in this slide would actually add 14 points. So if we add those to the total from the highlighted recommendations on the previous slide, New Hampshire's score would be 35 points and it would receive a B grade. So this is just to show that, you know, mainly the Freeing the Grid recommendations, with just a couple others that you would need to figure out process anyway on in terms of like timelines. It would make, you know, and especially if you added export capacity, export control methods, and then basing some of the review off of export capacity, you could add a total of, I guess you would add the points would be 35 total, and so that you would get a B grade. And then, of course, if you want to tackle all of these recommendations, like I said, you all will determine what the overhaul, what your update will look like, whether it's an overhaul or a more targeted update. But doing all of the recommendations we have here would add 46.5 points to your score and would bring you up to an A grade, 59 points total. There were just a few that we didn't recommend or get to. There was one on hosting capacity analysis being used in the screening process. That's in our data sharing category, and that one is definitely a more complicated or complex process that, you know, California has worked on a ton and is doing that now. DC and Arizona have some screening based on hosting capacity as well. It looks a little different than California, but they have it somewhat. So anyway, we didn't, you know, so it's not totally 63 points, but it's just because there were a few things that we may leave off, or you may decide that we're longer term projects. So with that, I'm gonna end here. Feel free to send us questions. Sorry that we didn't have time to go over them now, but here are, where you can find our resources, and happy to take questions later as well and answer by email.
Yeah, so we are exactly at time. I appreciate both of you joining us today and walking through this. Thank you for sharing your contact information. As I mentioned at the opening, we will be making a space on the Clean Energy New Hampshire webpage to host this. And we do understand that the Department of Energy is expecting that an outline for the interconnection report, which is due, I believe, at the end of November, will be coming out shortly in the next week or so. And that will allow an opportunity for stakeholders to comment. And now that we've had a little bit or a significantly more time to dig into this and have all the different reports, can use that to inform any stakeholders' final comments. If you did not get an invite to this meeting from me, I had put my email in chat, and I can make sure I send you the link if you reach out to me for where this report is, or where this recording will be located. But encourage you to reach out to Brian and Mari, and thank you again so much. Hope we all have a wonderful day. Any final thoughts, Mari or Brian? All right.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much. I didn't want to just continue, taking all the space here. Yeah, thank you all. And like I said, we're happy to continue answering questions after the presentation. So just feel free to follow up with us.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll be in touch and talk soon.
Great.
All right,
Thanks all.
take care.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye.